Let's go ahead and get started. Heavenly Father, we're thankful again that we have this opportunity to look into your word. Pray tonight, Lord, you will anoint my lips to say those things that you say. Anoint your word as it goes out. Anoint our hearts to receive. And we'll thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, we're still on Tuesday of the last week before the crucifixion. And this is our last night on Tuesday. Next week we jump to Wednesday, so we'll see what happens the next day. But tonight it's really long readings and a lot of material. So I'm going to move very quickly through it, and hopefully you'll catch what most of this is. Let's start off with the conversation of the widow's gift of 2 mites, one of the popular Bible stories, and especially we hear at offering time, you know. This is covered in Mark chapter 12, beginning with verse 41. Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and put in 2 mites, which make a quadrans. So he called his disciples to himself and said to them, Assuredly, I say to you that this poor widow more than all those who have given to the treasury. For all put in out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. Luke puts it this way, chapter 21, beginning of verse 1. And he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw also a certain poor widow putting in 2. So he said, Truly I say to you, that this poor widow has put in more than all. For all these, out of their abundance, have put in offerings for God, but she, out of her poverty, put in all the livelihood that she had. All right, so after Jesus has spent his day teaching and getting in discussions with the Pharisees and their questions, and it was a busy day for him. It's toward the evening, and he went into the court of the women. Now this is where the treasury was the court of the women. And so he probably was sitting down, maybe on one of the steps or one of the areas there, and just observing the treasury. Just quickly, in the court of the women was about 200 feet square, 200 on each side, feet. And then they had these colonnades, and on the other side of that there were some other areas of colonnades. And then along one wall it was covered. This is all outside, you understand. And so it was like a porch, and it was covered, and with these pillars. Well, in there is where they put their money, their treasury. So let me read this to you. This will kind of help you set the picture for what was going on there. According to the Mishnah, the women's court was just over 200 feet square between bounding lines. Each court on the outside was 60 feet square. The colonnade ran along the court, and within it, against the wall, the 13 chests, or trumpets, for charitable contributions were placed. These 13 chests were narrow at the mouth and wide at the bottom, shaped like trumpets. So if you give a trumpet bell, that's what they look like. There were actually 11 treasure chests of the temple for the voluntary offerings of money, and then also 2 at the gate of Susan for tax. Their specific objects were carefully marked. 9 were for the receipt of what was legally due by worshipers, the other 4 for strictly voluntary gifts. According to tradition, Edersheim says, trumpets 1 and 2, that would be the first 2 boxes, were appropriated for the half-shekel temple tribute of the current and of the past year. You remember they had to pay a temple tax every year. That was part of their obligation. Into trumpet 3, those women who had to bring turtle doves, well, it didn't have to be women, it could be men too. Anybody that had to bring a turtle dove for a sin offering. So if you were poor to have a lamb, you could bring turtle doves. So all right. So those that were at that class had to bring turtle doves for a burnt offering and a sin offering, dropped their equivalent in money. taken out and a corresponding number of turtle doves offered. So instead of going out and buying turtle doves and bringing them to the temple, you could just take the money that would cost for a turtle dove and put it in, and then at the end of the day, they would purchase or would take that equivalent of turtle doves and make those offerings. This not only saved the labor of so many separate sacrifices, but spared the modesty of those who might not wish to have the occasion or the circumstances of their offering be publicly known. Into this trumpet, Mary, the mother of Jesus, must have dropped the value of her offering in Luke 2, chapter 22 and 24, when the aged Simeon took the infant Savior in his arms and blessed God. So if you look at that story, that was where that went. Trumpet 4 similarly received the value of the offering of young pigeons. Temple 5, contributions for the wood used in the temple. In Trumpet 6, for the incense. And in Temple 7, for the golden vessels of the ministry were deposited. If I had put aside a certain sum for a sin offering, and any money was left over after its purchase, it was cast into Trumpet 8, similarly. Okay? So what we had here, so that they actually had these broken off. So if you wanted to give for the wood that went into the temple, because they were still building on the temple was not complete. So this was their construction fund. So you could put it into that trumpet, in that box. And if you wanted to pay for that when it was offered all the time, you put that in that box, and then you went to, and so on. So if you had money left over from your sin offering that you set aside for that, and it didn't take you that much, buying lambs or whatever, that was an offering that went into the box 8. Trumpets 9, 10, 11, 13 were destined for what was left over from trespass offerings, offerings of birds, the offering of the Nazarite, of the cleansed leper, and voluntary offerings. In all probability, this space where the 13 trumpets were placed was the treasury, where Jesus taught on that memorial Feast of Tabernacles in John 7 and 8. We can also understand how, from the peculiar and known destination of each of these 13 trumpets, the Lord could distinguish the contributions of the rich, which cast in of their abundance, from that of the poor widow, who of her penury had given all the living that she had. But there was also a special treasury chamber into which at certain times they carried the contents of the 13 chests, and besides what was called a chamber of the silent, where devout persons secretly deposited money, afterwards secretly employed for educating children of the pious poor. So they had all of these things situated, and so they had campaigns. So if they needed money for educating the poor Orthodox, then they would at times put this special box out there, and you could contribute to that. So if you look at it, it's really kind of similar to what we do today. We have funds for missions and funds for this, and give to them separately. Only there they had a separate box with this trumpet on the top, and you could just walk by and throw your money in. Kind of like the toll system that you have back east. Now Jesus was sitting there, and he watched this poor woman come and cast her 2 mites. Now 2 mites was the equivalent of one of our pennies. So if you kind of want to get a feeling for how much that was, it was equal about 1 penny. Now this was not sufficient to cover the cost of a turtle dove or a pigeon, and so she was probably giving into the treasuries designated for the upkeep of the temple. In other words, this was not something she had to give. Otherwise, it would have been more that she put in for a turtle dove. That would have been an obligation. So this was an offering, and so she was throwing it into one of those trumpets that had to do probably with the upkeep of the temple. It was a free will offering, and it says here of all that she had. It actually, when they figured it out, they figured it was probably all that she had to sustain her for 1 day. So two of these mites would would sustain a person that was poor with food or whatever they needed for one day. So she gave one day's offering. So we can kind of look at this and say she must have fasted that day and gave her offering of what she would have spent for food and whatever offering. And so it was this sacrifice that Jesus noted. He said she's given more, not that he didn't say she gave more than anybody else. She said she gave than everybody else. In other words, her offering with God far more than all the rest of who gave that day, that he sat there and watched. They were giving of their abundance, giving of her want. And that is the offering that God puts the most respect and cares the most about. Now notice something. Jesus did not condemn the rich that gave. He didn't say they'd have been a whole lot better if they'd have done it this way. He didn't condemn her. He commended her for her faith in giving what she didn't really have to give. She gave. Okay, we're going to move on. Now we move to our next section here with Jesus. He's still in. And this is the great prophecy. Now this is a lot of reading. I'll read as quickly as I can to get through this. It's found in Matthew, first of all, Matthew chapter 20. And we're going to read the whole chapter pretty much here. Well, we'll start with verses 1 and 2, and then we will eventually pick up the whole chapter. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Mark chapter 13 verses 1 and 2. Then as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here." And Jesus answered and said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? One stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." And finally, Luke chapter 21 verses 5 to 6. Then as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, "These things which you see, in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now, so we see Jesus as he leaves the court of the women, which is where the treasury was. His disciples begin to point out all the buildings of the temple. And they say, well, he was in the temple since the time he was 12. I mean, you should know the temple by now. Actually, the temple, according to Luke, had been under construction for 46 years at this time. 46 years. And Jesus had not been in the temple for over a year. So at this time, there was a lot of new construction that he hadn't seen. Not only were there buildings that were constructed in that time, but they also had added a lot of adornments, because rich people, you know, would say, "Hey, let's put a facade up there of real fancy stuff, and I'll pay for that." You know, that was the way. And then they do that same thing today, don't they? The exact same things. So, except when you go to churches now, there'll be a little plaque, you know, in memory of somebody the family gave, and then there's a bench or there's a something. Well, that was kind of what they did there, although I don't know that they put memorial. Maybe they did, I don't know. So as they're looking at all of the new things and how the temple had changed, and they're all talking, I'm sure, about some of the neat stuff there. Jesus says that there's not going to be one stone of all of this left. It's all going to be thrown down. And I'm sure the disciples understood that at some point the temple would be destroyed, because all buildings eventually end up being destroyed. I mean, you know, whether anybody does it or if it's just the weather or whatever, I mean, buildings end up being destroyed, earthquakes or whatever. But he predicted that there would not be one stone on another. In other words, it was going to be completely, utterly destroyed. So, and this happened, we found out, about 30 some years later when Rome came in. But we're going to look at that in a little more detail here in a second. All right, so that's the first two verses of 24th chapter of Matthew and Mark and Luke. So it sets the stage for our next section here. All right, let's read Matthew chapter 24, beginning with verse 3. So Jesus now has left the temple. They've gone to the court of the Gentiles, looked at everything, and he has now up to Mount Olives, Mount Olivet. And it was evidently his intention to spend the night on Mount Olivet. This is in the springtime, so it was probably warm. And as they often did, they would just sleep out under the stars. So it was evidently the intention of Jesus to go up on the mountain and spend the evening on Mount Olivet. Verse 3 of Matthew 24. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceive you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines, pestilence, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whosoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Jerusalem, in Judea, flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field and not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. But then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor shall ever be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go look. Or look, he is in the inner rooms. Do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. Verse 34, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place. Verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. And two men will be in the field. One will be taken, the other left. Two women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken, and the other left. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched out and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you all also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household, to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant, whom his master when he comes will find so doing. Assuredly I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants, and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that servant on a day when he is not looking for him, and at an hour that he is not aware of, and will cut him in two, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. All right, I'm not going to read the other two versions. They are found in Mark chapter 13, verses 3 to 33, and Luke 21, verses 7 to 36, simply because it would take up the rest of the evening reading. and so I'm going to forego that. You can read that at your leisure. Now, I do want you to notice that I have placed some division lines in here on your notes, and that's to help you divide out what we're going to be talking about. How this whole prophecy of the Lord is broken down. Now, Matthew 24 is probably one of the most misquoted, misunderstood portions of prophecy that you run into. You probably heard of the great end time revival. We're going to have this great end time revival. And it's based on Matthew 24. But I will say unequivocally here, there is no great end time revival for the church. In fact, this chapter teaches just the opposite. The problem is that people read this chapter and they miss what Jesus said at the beginning. And they miss what this chapter is doing. Why did Jesus answer? Why was Jesus saying this to his disciples? So the first thing we need to look at is say, what is Jesus talking about here? And we find that in Matthew 24, chapter 3. Now notice this. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives. Now they've gone up to the Mount of Olives, and they've probably found the place that they're going to spend the night, and they're sitting there, and probably on the top of the mountain where they can see the city, and they've looked at the city, and they're resting. And notice what happens here. The disciples came to him privately. Now we know from Mark's account that it was actually Peter, James, John, and Andrew that came to him. The other disciples may have been there also, or at least, they were all there, I'm sure, but they probably heard the answer. But it was these four guys that came to him with the question. And I want you to notice, because this is key to understanding the whole rest of this discourse. If you don't understand this, you don't understand the rest of the discourse. And that's what happens too often. People just read the chapter and they blow right by chapter 3, and then they try to figure out what Jesus was talking about. All right, so let's look in here. So these three came to him, and they said, "Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" They asked three specific questions. First question, when will these things be? What are the things that he was talking about? To understand that, we go back to verses 1 and 2. What did Jesus say? There's not going to be a stone left on this temple. Prior to that, he talked about, and some of the stuff that we've already studied, he talked about things that were going to come to pass. How the Pharisees, were going to be this in trouble, and all these things were going to happen. And it was all going to be piled on the religious leaders' heads because of they were treating people. And, we've read that. Right? So his disciples are concerned, and they say, when are these things going to be? The second thing they said, what will be the sign of your coming? Now, it's important that we note here that they weren't talking about his coming to get the church. This is where a lot of people get confused. Well, he's coming. Well, he's talking about coming to get the church. No, he's not, because the church wasn't here yet. They had no idea about the church at this point. Jesus had only alluded to the fact up to this point that the Gentiles were going to be saved. So the church was not in place yet. Now, he'd been teaching about it, but they didn't get it. They don't get it until after the resurrection. And then all of a sudden they open up and they understand. But Jesus, remember, taught them after the resurrection. So there was a little time there when they could get the real understanding of what he was talking about. But here they asked, when are you coming? When are you coming to be Messiah? So when is the temple going to be destroyed? And when are you coming as Messiah? You can kind of see the consternation. He'd been teaching them he was the Messiah. He was going to come as Messiah. And now he says the temple's going to be completely destroyed. Well, if the temple's going to be destroyed, when are you coming as Messiah? What's wrong here? It didn't fit. He was coming to set up his kingdom, and yet he's saying the temple's going to be destroyed. It didn't match. See? And then the third thing he asked is, what is the end of this age that we are in? Three distinct, separate questions. Now, how did Jesus answer these questions? Jesus was not a scatterbrain. And I get almost upset sometimes at preachers because, they seem to think that Jesus was a scatterbrain. That they asked three questions, so he answered all three questions in random order. That wouldn't make sense unless he first took each one and said, now I'm going to answer this question and then he'd answer them in any order he wanted. But he didn't do that. So we have to make the assumption that since he's a God of order, he had to have answered those questions in the same order that they were asked. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. All right, so let's start off and look at this. So I'm just going to kind of go through this quickly. There were signs that preceded the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, a lot of preachers have used, and before I go any further, let me make this. A lot of this stuff applies to the church age, because just like all prophecy, there is a primary and there is a secondary. Primary fulfillment and a secondary fulfillment. And a lot of this just has to do with human nature, but the things that preceded the destruction of Jerusalem are the same things that will preclude the coming of the Antichrist, the age that we're in. I mean, we're going to see these same things because that's just the way it is. Okay? But it doesn't, the primary fulfillment of these are not the church age, at least in the first two. Okay, so let's look at these. Number one, there's going to be many false Christs. Many false Christs. Now, from the time that Jesus is crucified until the destruction of Jerusalem, that whole period of time covers the entire New Testament. Rome was not destroyed during the time of the writing of the New Testament. So what we see when we look and read through Paul, his letters, when we see Peter and John's writings, what we see is what was going on before the destruction of the temple. Now that's important because we're going to see many of the things that Jesus talks about are written in the New Testament. We look at them and see this is what was going on. One of these is that there will be many Christs. Now, according to Josephus, who was, of course, the historian from that time, there were many who claimed to be the Christ, including Dositheus, the Samaritan, Simon Magus, and Theudas. Anyway, these are just some. But there were tons of these guys who claimed to be the Christ, the Messiah. And Paul alluded to the fact that there was those who said they were the Christ. But he said, don't be fooled, because that's not them. Also, wars and rumors of wars. How many times you hear a preacher get them say, when you see wars and rumors of wars, be ready, Jesus is coming. Well, the primary fulfillment of that had nothing to do with the church. It's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And that was exactly what happened. It is recorded in the history of Rome that the most violent agitations prevailed in the Roman Empire previous to the destruction of Jerusalem. 4 emperors, Nero, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, suffered violent deaths in the short space of 18 months. Okay? In consequence of these changes in the government, there were commotions throughout the empire, parties were formed, and bloody and violent wars were the consequence of attachment to the particular emperors. This is the more remarkable, as at the time that the prophecy was made, the empire was in a state of peace. When Jesus said there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, the empire was basically at peace. I mean, Rome, there was no infighting. I mean, you had these Roman emperors and they were all, right there. But after the death of Jesus, the Roman Empire began to fall apart. There were wars, there was infighting, there was all of this stuff going on until the destruction of Jerusalem. There were rumors of wars. Wars were declared or threatened but not carried into execution. Josephus says that Bardanes and after him Valigius declared war against the Jews, but it was not carried into execution. In other words, they threatened to come down and wipe them out, but they didn't do it. He also says that Vitellius, governor of Syria, declared war against the Aretas, king of Arabia, and wished to lead his army through Palestine, but the death of Tiberius prevented the war. All this stuff is happening within that 35-year period after the death of Jesus. It said, nation will rise against nation. At Caesarea, the Jews and Syrians contended about the right to the city, and 20,000 of the Jews were slain. At this blow, the whole nation of the Jews was exasperated and carried war and desolation through the Syrian cities and villages. Sedation and civil war spread throughout Judea. Italy was also thrown into civil war by the contest between Otho and Vitellius for the crown. You didn't know all this stuff took place before the destruction of Jerusalem, did you? There will be famines. So we've looked at it. There are going to be many false Christs. There's going to be wars and rumors of wars. Nations are going to rise against nations. There's going to be famine. All right? There was a famine foretold by Agabus in Acts 11:28, which is mentioned as having occurred by Tacitus, Suetonius, and Eusebius. All these are historians, by the way. And which was so severe in Jerusalem, Josephus says that many people perished for want of food. 4 times in the reign of Claudius, famine prevailed in Rome, Palestine, and Greece. Pestilence, raging epidemic diseases, the plague sweeping off multitudes of people at once. It is commonly called the attendant of famine, and often produced by it. A pestilence is recorded as raging in Babylonia AD 40, and in Italy in AD 66. Both of these took place before the destruction of Jerusalem. Wow. Wow. A lot of interesting stuff here, isn't there? Earthquakes. Earthquakes. In prophetic language, earthquakes sometimes mean political commotions. Literally, and this is from, I don't know if I put the citation on here. Let me look quick. Brodius, I think, is where I got this. Oh, it's from the Jewish Wars, a book called The Jewish Wars. Anyway, in prophetic language, earthquakes sometimes mean political commotions. Literally, they are tremors or shaking of the earth, and often shaking cities and towns to ruin. The earth opens, and houses and people sink indiscriminately to destruction. Many of these are mentioned as preceding the destruction of Jerusalem. Tacitus mentions one in the reign of Claudius at Rome, and says that in the reign of Nero, the cities of Laodicea, Hierapolis, and Colossae were overthrown, and the celebrated Pompeii was overwhelmed and almost destroyed by an earthquake. Others are mentioned as occurring in Smyrna, Miletus, Chios, and Samos. Luke adds, and fearful sights, and this is in his version of this, he adds, and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. Josephus, who had probably never heard of this prophecy, and certainly would have done nothing designedly to show its fulfillment, records the prodigies and signs which he says preceded the destruction of the city. A star, says he, resembling a sword, stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. At the feast of unleavened bread, during the night, a bright light shone round the altar and the temple, so that it seemed to be bright day for half an hour. At the feast of unleavened bread, during the night, a bright light shone, I read that already. The eastern gate of the temple of solid brass, fastened with strong bolts and bars, and which had been shut with difficulty by 20 men, opened in the night of its own accord. 2 days after that feast, he says, before sunsetting, chariots and groups of troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding the cities. A great noise, as of the sound of a multitude, was heard in the temple, saying, let us remove hence. 4 years before the war began, Jesus, the son of Artaeus, the Phlebeian, and husbandman, came to the Feast of Tabernacles, when the city was in peace and prosperity, and began to cry aloud, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, against the bridegroom and the bride, and a voice against this whole people. He was scourged, and at every stroke of the whip he cried, woe, woe to Jerusalem. This cry, he says, was continued every day, this is Josephus says, was continued every day for 7 years before he was killed in the siege of the city, exclaiming, woe, woe to myself also. So the prophecy of Jesus in its primary fulfillment was the destruction of Jerusalem. All of these things were given as a sign to those people, and primarily to the disciples, because they were the only ones there. There was not a multitude. This was to his disciples. So he was warning them about what was going to happen to Jerusalem. They asked, he told them. Then he went on to say that all of these are just the beginning of a time of sorrows. That sorrows would last for 2,000 years so far. And it would be persecution and tribulation. Make a note here, we've often heard of the time of the tribulation, and people say, well, you know, the tribulation is coming. No, the tribulation is here. Because tribulation applies to the Jewish nation, to the Jews. They have been in tribulation for over 2,000 years. There is a time coming that's referred to Jacob's troubles, or the Great Tribulation, which is the last 7 years. And this will be a time that's never been seen. We have been in the beginnings of this tribulation, or through this time of tribulation, for 2,000 years. And that's where people get confused. They think tribulation, time of sorrows, that's the last week, and so now they start fitting all this earthquakes and all these things as meaning before the final week. But if we read Revelation carefully, none of that happens before the final week. In fact, it's peace. They're going to cry peace and safety. They're going to have a world ruler that's everything is peaceful, everything is right, until that last week, or the last 3.5 years, when he turns on Israel. There's not going to be earthquakes and all this violent stuff going on. He's just going to bring his armies together to wipe them out. So we have to get our prophetic limits here and understand what was going on here. Now, Jesus makes a very logical step here. He's told his disciples, remember, he's talking to his disciples. He's not talking to a multitude, he's talking to his disciples. And he makes a very logical jump here. He says, this is what you're going to see happen before the destruction of Jerusalem. All of these things are going to happen. Okay, so now what does he say? He foretells what would happen to the disciples and those who became Christians before the destruction of Jerusalem. That seems logical, doesn't it? He's telling them what's going to happen to Jerusalem. He's telling them what's going to happen to the Jewish nation. He's already told them why in his teachings that they've been listening to for 3 years. He's already said why it's going to happen. Now he's telling him what are the signs that tell you it's going to happen before it happens. Isn't it logical then to say to them, now let me tell you what's going to happen to you guys, you 12 or 11 that are here. Let me explain to you what's going to happen. And that's what he does here. He says, many followers would be afflicted or beaten on orders from the Sanhedrin. Then, of course, we have examples of that. Peter, John, Paul, Silas. Some would be killed. Stephen, Acts chapter 7. James in Acts chapter 12. Peter and Paul and most of the apostles were all killed. Nero killed many in the Colosseums in Rome. We think about all of the animals and all the Christians that were brought in there. These were all killed by Nero before the destruction of Jerusalem. Isn't that interesting? The Jews were, and still are, hated by all nations. So the Jews themselves would be hated of all nations. But also, many nations made Christianity illegal. It was not legal to be a Christian. And that's why they suffered such persecution. Paul, in his journeys and all the things that happened, many of the areas he went to, it was illegal. And of course the Sanhedrin declared it was illegal. And so when they declared it, all the allies and the Jews said, well, it's illegal too. Go along with that one. Now notice what he says here. I know I'm not giving you verses, but there's a lot of stuff here. But one of the things he says is that they would be persecuted for his name's sake. Because they followed him. Because they took on his identity. Because they stood up with his authority. That's why they were being persecuted. Now, I guess you could say that's kind of a compliment. That's a way of encouraging them, letting them know it's not because of what they do, it's because of who they do it for. And, many people, I think that would be a comfort to them to know today when they get persecuted. It's not because of who they are or what they are. It's simply because of who they're doing it for. Now he also said that there would be many who will stumble and fall because of the persecution, and they will betray others and turn on them. He says in verse 12, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. What is the lawlessness that he's talking about? We find that in Jerusalem, that the city, and in fact Judah, was gradually taken over by a group of zealots. I don't know if you ever saw Jesus in Nazareth when we had it out at the amphitheater, but one of the big things there was the centurions and all the soldiers chasing the zealots on horseback. I don't know if you remember, they had sword fights and all that stuff going on. These zealots were rebels, and they were determined to take Judah out of the hands of Rome. And so they were your present-day terrorists, is what they were. We would brand them as terrorists. While they were not successful at that time of taking Judah away from Rome, they were very successful in getting followers. And so they were in the city, and there was this constant turmoil within the city that these guys were stirring up. And it was this turmoil, this popularity within the city of Jerusalem that led to the final destruction of Jerusalem. Because they had gained so much strength within the city, it was lawlessness. The law of the city was regulated by the Romans. So when the Romans came into town, everything was quiet. But when this all started, Rome couldn't send enough people there to keep peace. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound familiar? But it was this lawlessness. It was these zealots that were in there. And so they were stirring up peace. And what they were saying was, we need the Messiah now. And we need to destroy Rome, and we need to have somebody rule. Well, the Messiah isn't here, and he may never come, and it all may be a fantasy. And so, as people can do, they can twist Scripture like they do today. Well, this was probably spiritualizing the coming of the Messiah. And we can set up our own kingdom, and we can be the Messiah, sort of say, in a spiritual sense. We can set up our kingdom, and we can serve Jehovah. Now, they were Orthodox. They believed, strongly Pharisaical teachings. And of course, they rejected the Sadducees completely, who were aligned with Rome, and the Herodians, and they wanted to do with them. And so they had this turmoil going. Well, you can see how after a while that would wear on somebody. Christians, and primarily, who were there, when they began to hear, well, this is a joke. He's not coming back. This is all spiritualizing. And I'll say here, this has happened even in our age, where preachers get up and say, there's no second coming. There's no resurrection. That's all just a bunch of Tommy rot. And we're just going to live our lives and stand before the white throne, and we either make it or we don't make it. And there is no special, you hear them. If you turn on the Christian radio long enough, you'll hear enough of these guys coming on. They pay to get on, paid stations. And that's what we had in these days. And so Jesus warned them. He said, there's those that are going to stumble because of the persecution and because of the lawlessness. They're going to stumble and fall. And we know Paul even had one of his fellow preachers that fell away, having loved this present world. So it happened. During the siege of Jerusalem, there were false prophets. Many false prophets, he says. Well, Josephus says, the tyrannical zealots who ruled the city suborned many false prophets to declare that aid would be given to the people from heaven. This was done to prevent them from attempting to desert and to inspire confidence in God. And you can see that in the Jewish Wars, book 6, chapters 5 and 2 and 3. The church also had many false prophets, according to 2 Corinthians 11, 13 to 15, Galatians 2, 1 to 4, 1 Timothy 1, 3 to 7, 19, 20, 2 Timothy 3, 8 and 9, Titus 1, 10, 11, 2 Peter 2, 1 to 3, and Jude 1, 4, 8, 10, 12, 16, and 19. You can go out to the website, go back through this, you can get all those off the website. Okay, so all these false prophets, so what was happening? These zealots, they taught that help would come from heaven. It would not be the Messiah coming, but would come down basically and help them if they stood up against Rome. Just hang tough, the Calvary's coming. So just hang tough. And that's what they taught, because they didn't want people leaving Jerusalem. So Jesus is warning his disciples that all of this stuff is going to happen. He said, because of the persecutions, false prophets, and apostasies, the love of God would grow cold in many. But those that endured to the end, or unto death, would be saved. Now, the first time we look at this, we say, oh, you mean they had to be martyred? No, every man's going to die, right? And basically what What Jesus is saying here is exactly what I've said, I don't know how many times, you're never saved until you're gone. Until you leave this place, you're never saved. Salvation comes at the point of death or resurrection, or rapture, the right word. Until that time, you can fall away at any time. And that's what Jesus was warning here. That many are going to fall away because of persecution and lawlessness and all these things, and they're going to fall away. But the one who maintains his integrity with God, who keeps the faith until the end, whether that end is martyrdom, natural death, or rapture, that's the one who is saved. It doesn't matter if you run 3/4 of the race and fall out in the last quarter. Are you running the race at the end? Whatever that end is. And that's basically what Jesus was saying here. Now some people have taken that to mean the only way you could be saved is be martyred. Well, that wasn't what he said at all. He didn't say martyrdom here. He merely said hang on to the end. Now, he gave some specific things that they were supposed to do when they saw these things. Verse 15, therefore when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. Now some people have taken the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9. Chapter 9. And in chapter 9 he talks about the desolation that will be set up in the holy place, or in the temple. And this is talked about in other places, so we know what he's talking about. But it wasn't just the setting up of an idol in the holy place. Roman legions probably did that, but we have no record of that. Okay, and if it was meant to be that, there would be some record in the Word or in history or something. But what it's talking about is the holy place could mean any place within the temple complex. It was all considered holy. And then you had the Holy of Holies. That was the inner place. The rest of it was considered holy. And so Daniel talks about the abomination of desolation that will be set up in the holy place. Jesus here says that when you see these signs, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, this wasn't the setting up of the idol as much as it was the march of ungodly men into Jerusalem. At the end time, Antichrist is going to come into Jerusalem. He's going to allow the Jews to have their temple and worship for 3.5 years, and then he's coming in, and he's coming into the temple, and we know he's going to set up his idol in the temple and require everybody to worship him, much like they did and Nebuchadnezzar did in Babylon. Everybody worship me. The Antichrist is going to do, the beast actually, is going to do this in the end time. Whether that was done at the time of Rome coming into Jerusalem, we don't know. What we do know is that the armies came into the temple. And in those days, the armies were always preceded by their standard bearers, who had the big eagle sign of Rome up on the standards. So you can see them marching into the temple square with their big banners and their armies as they begin to destroy the temple. So he said, when you see that, when you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, when you see them marching into the temple, he said, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, who is he talking about here? It's easy to lose track right here of who he's talking about. He was talking again about the disciples and those that were their converts. So when we see in Acts where Paul was going out and taking the gospel, what was he doing? He was reporting back to Jerusalem, to the church in Jerusalem that was pastored by James. So they had a large church. I mean, the day of Pentecost, there was how many added? 3,000 in one day. So there were a lot of Christians in Jerusalem. Jesus is talking to Christians here. He's still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. But now he says, destroyed, disciples, here's what's going to happen. These are the things to look for. All right, they're going to have all these things happening. Now, here's what you do. When you see that army, when you see it coming around, he said, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop, don't go down and take anything out of the house. If you're in the field, don't go back for more clothes. Or, to be more specific, when they worked, they took their outer garment and laid it aside so they could work without that heavy garment they used. You know, we talked about it as a raincoat, it was everything. Don't even pick it up. Take off. Run. Run. Get going. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. Why? Because it's a tough journey. You've got to run to the mountains. It's going to be difficult. And pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. What has the Sabbath got to do with it? Christians weren't necessarily Sabbath keepers, but they were still under the law. But you could only go so far on a Sabbath day. Now, if you were running for your life, then you could go ahead and run, but the trouble was, it was hard to find anybody that would help you. Because on the Sabbath, they didn't help. There was nothing open. You couldn't go buy anything. Everything was closed. So you're making a journey. You're taking off to flee Jerusalem on a moment's notice with no supplies, no clothes, no food, and no way to get it if it's on the Sabbath. So they weren't to pray that the destruction didn't come. They were to pray that it didn't come on the Sabbath. Or it didn't come in winter when it would be difficult to travel. You know, we spiritualize things Jesus said a lot, but he was very practical. He said, this is what you need to be praying for. It's like we're going to Israel next month. You know, would it be outlandish to pray, God, let the weather be nice? Yeah, the same thing. We want to go enjoy ourselves. We want the weather nice. We don't want it pouring rain or 95 degrees or 100 degrees. We want the weather nice. That's something we can ask for. All right. So he's telling them what to do. So when they saw this coming, they were to flee into the mountains without stopping to pack. Eusebius states, again, historian, that the Jerusalem Christians did flee to the city of Pella, which was in Perea on the east side of the Jordan River, one of the places where Jesus ministered. Interesting. He also noted that not one Christian was killed at the siege of Jerusalem. Now that's a historian. That's not some modern preacher who's got some idea. This is a guy who wrote from that period. Not one Christian was killed. Now whether that's true or not, we don't know. I mean, you know, for sure. Because they didn't have, like we have technology today to be able to figure all that. But that's what he said. And so the Christians obeyed the commandment of Jesus when he said, when you see these things, get going. Flee, run, run. And so they did. All right. The last one, or not the last one, I'm sorry. The next one is the signs that preceded the coming of the Messiah. So we had the signs of the destruction of Jerusalem, and along with that, what the Christians would be going through and what they should be looking for. They weren't Christians yet. They didn't know they were Christians, but that's what they were at that point. And now Jesus answers their second question. What is the sign of your coming? They already recognized him as the Messiah. They'd already figured out that he wasn't coming to set up his kingdom now. He told them he was going to have to die. So they had reconciled to some degree that idea that there was going to be some time between now and when he came again. This tells us, number one, that they had figured things out a little bit. That finally they were starting to see that he was not going to be crowned Messiah right now. That there was going to be an intervening time. Whether they understood how that worked or not, I don't know. But they had at least that concept, because they said, when are you coming back? You can't come back unless you're leaving. Right? All right. He says that the destruction of Jerusalem would signal the start of the tribulation, which will culminate with Jacob's troubles, or the great tribulation of Revelation. He says in verse 21, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days be shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." Now this is a portion of Scripture that's been used, and people have tried to decipher this for years as to what we've been talking about here. Number one, if you look back over the last 2,000 years, and you look back at all of recorded history, you will never find any nation that has gone through what the Jews have gone through in the last 2,000 years. When you think about it, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, those on the coasts of Galilee, all of these Edomites and all of these people, Syrians, they all have had their nation. Some of the nations are not there anymore. They're gone. But the people were not persecuted, or they may have been for a short period of time. Usually they were destroyed in war. Within a few years, that was the end of it. Either they rebuilt their city or their nation, or they just were disseminated out around others, and that was the end of it. But look at the Jews. They have been persecuted. I don't care where they go. They go to Germany, they go to Poland, they were up in all of the Ukraine areas, and what happened? Here comes a guy named Hitler, and he wipes them out, and killed millions of them. And before that, it was the Rome, and then it was the next leaders and the next world powers, and every time something happened, they blamed it on the Jews. Muhammad, he blamed the Jews for everything, and so you have Islam versus Israel versus the Jews. And this conflict has been going on and on and on, and every time it seemed like they were ready to make a big move, it would just be smashed down again. Now they have their own nation, and now they're starting to bud out, and Jesus talks about that here a little bit. They're starting to grow a little bit. They're a nation, but get Google Earth and take a look at Israel. There's just a little tiny spot down here on the earth, and look at the rest of the size of the earth, and there's this little tiny strip of land down here, and everybody wants that little piece of land. It's unprecedented. This is something the world has never seen, and they will never see it again. This is the tribulation that has happened to them, and it's of course because that they turned their back on God. The destruction of Jerusalem signaled the start of this period of time. When Jesus was there, it was a relatively time of peace. 35 years later, the whole place is gone. Wow, that's pretty quick. That's pretty quick. Now, during this period of time, he says here that unless those days are shortened. Now, we've looked at that in different directions. What in the world is he talking about? I've heard some preachers say, that the world is spinning faster. The days are coming and going fast. That's not it. We still have the same 24-hour days as they had in Jesus' day. I don't think the earth is speeded up at all. It still makes the same turns around the sun. Takes just as long, 365 days plus one every 4 years. But what Jesus was talking about is he had to shorten the time of the tribulation period, of this time that he has turned his back on Israel. If he didn't, no flesh would be saved. And I think we are seeing this today, to me anyway, when I look at the world events. Of course, I tend to look at the world events from a biblical standpoint. And so when I see all of this stuff happening, you've got Iran with nuclear weapons. You've got, what's that other country over there? They have nuclear weapons. Afghanistan doesn't happen, but they could get them probably anytime they wanted it next door. You've got North Korea, who now has nuclear weapons. You've got Russia, who has nuclear weapons. You have China, who has nuclear weapons. All of these nations are against Israel. Now, if he allowed this tribulation to continue, what would happen? We've probably been very close to nuclear war on more than one occasion. You know, all it takes is one person to push the trigger and instant annihilation. And Jesus didn't say that the elect would be killed or no Jews would be saved. He said all flesh. In other words, everybody. There wouldn't be any flesh saved. They'd wipe themselves out with nuclear war. Now, you can take that interpretation if you wish, or you can take it away. It doesn't matter. That's my opinion based on what I see. But we are right on the brink of annihilation because we have madmen that can push buttons. I'm not so worried about Russia and China because they have politicians that run their country that have at least a certain amount of common sense. We have a president, I think, has a certain amount of common sense. But when you get to some of these other countries, these rogue countries that will do anything for based on their emotions, you know, all it would take was one button. And so Jesus said he had to shorten the time. It's been over 2,000 years now. I wonder how long he was initially intending to go. You know, I don't know. But he said he's going to have to shorten it. And he's going to do it for one reason, for the elect's sake. Those who he has chosen, those who he has elected. Now there's those that says he's talking about the church, and I disagree. The reason I disagree is because the church is made up of individuals. Our salvation is not based on a nation. It's not based on what anybody else does. It's what we do. Everything is wiped out today. Where do we go? Is the church affected? No. Because as individuals, we're saved. If we're living for God, we know where we go. Whether it's a nuclear bomb that puts us there, whether it's cancer that puts us there, or a heart attack, or a wreck in a car, or natural death, we all end up at the same point as long as we finish our race and we hold out to the end, whatever that end is. So the church is not affected. The only ones that would be elect or chosen that would be affected would be the Jews, because they would never be able to fulfill the prophecy and the intent that God has for that nation. So the elect has to be the Jews. He's doing it for their sake. He's not doing it for our sake. We personally don't care, or at least we shouldn't care. Whether we get blown up or however we die, we die. That's not the issue. And so he's doing it for the elect's sake, or for the sake of Israel. And this again just shows his love for that nation. Now he says, if anybody says Christ is here, or Christ is there, don't follow it. There's going to be many during this period of time that say they are Christ. How many have we seen in our lifetime that come up and said they are Christ? You know, we've seen guys run off the islands and take people out there and then they all commit suicide, or they go out in the desert and wait for a UFO to come because, gee, I'm the Messiah. Charles Manson said he was Jesus Christ. And he had followers. Look what they did. You know, there are people all over say they're Christ. And it's interesting. He says, don't go into the desert and look for them. somebody out here in the desert, some guru, who's Jesus. Don't go into some holy place or hidden place in a grotto someplace because there's somebody down there who claims to be Christ. Notice what he says. Don't look in the inner rooms. Don't look in the secret places. Don't go out in the desert where there's nobody. Why? Verse 27, for as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man be. He's not saying that his coming is going to be accompanied by flashes of lightning. That's not what he's saying here. He said if you sit out on your porch and you look out there and all of a sudden there's a flash of lightning, nobody has to tell you that that is a flash of lightning. Right? And depending on how close it is, nobody has to tell you that it happened, because if it's close enough, it'll shake you out of your chair. I've had it when they've hit right close to me, and I mean the earth shakes, you shake, and you wonder if this is your last day on earth. I mean, I've had those things hit, and they just seem like they don't quit. These lightning bouncing around, and especially in Oklahoma. You were back there. Terrible place. Storm. Be back in there, Indiana. But man, that's scary to death. You know? But the point Jesus is making here is that when he comes, it's not going to be in a secret place. He doesn't go out to the desert to see him, because every eye will see him. It's going to be, when he comes, it's not going to be secret. It's going to be wild. And then, how do you know that he came? It says, where the carcasses are, that's where the eagles will be. You see, this whole dissertation, this whole thing here, up to this point, is about what? Jerusalem and the nation of Israel. That's what it's all about. He's thrown in the disciples and the Christians so that they knew how to act and what was going to happen during this period of time. But it all has to do with this period of time. So we see Jerusalem absolutely destroyed. And what do we get the next vision of Israel, of Jerusalem rather? What do we see? Carcasses. He says, when I come back, there's going to be carcasses. And you're going to know there's carcasses because the eagles, which are huge vultures over there. Eagles don't eat carrion, our bald eagles, you know, they eat fish and fresh stuff. But these eagles, they call eagles over there, are actually huge vultures. The sky will be full of the vultures as they come to eat the carcasses of the armies of Antichrist. This is not going to, you don't have to go someplace to try to find him. He's telling you where he's going to be. And of course, he's talking about the Battle of Armageddon. The Valley of Megiddo. It's going to be full of blood, dead men's bones. It's going to take them years to bury everybody, even though they hire all these people to go do it. All right. What happens after that? Well, it says in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they that see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So what we have is a view here, again, Israel, Jerusalem. He comes, he defeats the armies of Antichrist. He sets up his kingdom. Now, this picture of him coming in the clouds can mean two things. It can reflect his coming on the great white horse that we see in Revelation and the Battle of Armageddon. But he covers that. If that were the case, then it wouldn't happen immediately after. It would have happened, he'd be there, you know. So what I think we have here is not a picture of him coming as Messiah. Rather, we see him coming as judge. It's because he comes as Messiah, sets up his kingdom for 1,000 years. They're going to be under the Messiah. At the end of 1,000 years, what happens? War. And he has to come again. And notice how this goes. It says he is going to come with all the power and glory immediately after tribulation. The sun and the stars are going to be darkened. Well, we know from the book of Revelation that doesn't happen until after the 1,000 years of reign. So Jesus is skipping that 1,000-year reign of the Messiah. That wasn't one of their questions. Right? So he's answering their question. And so he skips that part and moves right in to then the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. Why are they going to mourn? Because they're going to be standing before him in judgment. That's my opinion anyway. Notice verse 31. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the ends of heaven to the other. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. Now he goes into the parable of the fig tree, and I'm not going to go into all of it. Basically it says when you see the fig tree starting to sprout, then you know spring is here. It's getting ready to bust out in leaves. So when you see all of these things happening that I've told you about, it's at hand. Like the fig tree, keep your eye on Jerusalem. When you see these things, know that this is what's going to happen. Okay? All right, that was the fig tree. Finally, he says that heaven and earth will pass away. He says it may pass away. He said it will pass away. But his word will never pass away. Why? Because he is the Word. The Word that was made flesh. He precedes everything. And he precludes everything. All right. So finally, now we get to the third question, which is the sign preceding the end of this age. What age? He's already talked about the age of the law. He's already talked about the Jewish nation. But what about this age? What is the age that he's talking about here? He was in at this point, in fact, from the time of Nebuchadnezzar, we've been in the age of the Gentile rule. So what he is doing is taking this to say, when is Gentile rule going to end? All right. First of all, he says, no one knows the day nor the hour that will mark the end of this age. Now, how do we know he wasn't talking about the prior events? Because the prior events were laid out by Daniel in Daniel chapter 9. We know when all those things are going to happen, right down to the day. So this scripture could not apply to that. Jesus also just got done telling them, when you see these things, run, because that's the day it's going to happen. Right? So he couldn't then turn around and say, but nobody knows the day nor the hour, because he just told you how to know the day or the hour when that's going to happen. So this scripture does not apply to that. It applies to a different event. The event that precedes the ending of this Gentile rule. Notice in the talking about Jerusalem, a lot of things happened before the actual destruction of Jerusalem. These were signs. These were things that were happening at the end of that Jerusalem period, right? Well, he carries that same idea over here. He says, but of that day, what day? The end of the age. No one knows, not the hour, not even the angels of heaven, but the only one that knows is my Father in heaven. I'm not going to jump off on that one. We're going to just move ahead. Verse 37, but as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Coming of the Son of Man. Is he talking about his coming as Messiah? If so, it doesn't make sense, because the next verse says, then two men will be in the field, one will be taking and the other left. What has that got to do with Messiah? Absolutely nothing. That's the point. What he's talking about here is what we find in Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians, when we talk about it, we find it in Paul's writings. There is a day coming when the church will be caught away out of this world. That's an important point. It's a very important time in the history of this age, because it's one of the signs, or one of the beginnings of the end of this age. It says two men are going to be out in the field. They're going to be doing their work. One of them's going to turn around, the other one's gone. They're going to be sitting, two women are going to be grinding. And in those days, the grinding was the women did a lot of it in the towns, and it was like a stone that was about a foot in diameter, and there was another stone on top, and they had a handle on it, and they would turn it by hand. And if it was a large one, there would be one woman on one side and one on this side, and they would hang on to this handle, and you would pull it, and then it come around, then that lady would pull it, and you would relax, and then you'd pull it, and then she'd pull it. And as you did this, you would take corn or whatever you were grinding, wheat, and pour it in the hole in the middle, and then out would come the ground wheat. So it was a two-man operation, unless you just had a little small one that you used in the house. And so you're going to have two women. One of them's going to be pulling and going to wait for it to be pulled, and there won't be anybody sitting there to pull it the other way. Two will be grinding. One will be taken, and the other left. Wow. Then what's going to happen? He said, watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. People are going to be as it was in the days of Noah. They're going to be eating and drinking. Now, we can take that literally, the days of Noah, and I do to some degree, because we know it was extremely wicked in the days of Noah. So we can take that along with it, I think. But Jesus, I don't think, was really alluding to the spiritual or cultural situation of the world at that time, as much as the point they didn't know it was coming. They had been warned. Noah told them, 120 years, says he preached. 120 years, he told them rain was coming. Something was going to happen. But they did not pay attention. They didn't know it was coming. All of a sudden, God said, okay, get in the ark. They got in the ark, put the animals in, and God slammed the door. Now, we can talk about the 120 years of Noah's preaching. But to me, if I was alive in that day, and all of a sudden lined up going into this boat, I think I'd get a little concerned. But they didn't. They were just marrying, doing about their normal things. Giving and marrying, being drunk, having fun, doing the things they wanted to do. And all of a sudden, what's that? What's that? Maybe it just started as a little drizzle. And it just got more and more and more and more and more until it was pouring down, it was coming out of the earth, and they were all perished. And that's the way it's going to be with the Son of Man. We can preach our heads off that Jesus is coming and get ready. Jesus is coming. There are people I know Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, and I know that they have not made assurance that they would go if Jesus came. They haven't. They hear it. They go on about their work. They go on about what they're doing. They enjoy life as if nothing is ever going to happen. One will be at the mill. The others, gone. Gone. But know this. that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched his house to be broken into. I don't know about you, but if I knew a thief was coming in my house tonight, I'd be sitting in the front room, and I'd have all my friends with me. You know, there'd be my Smith and Wesson, they'd be over here, and Winchester would be over here, and my Bersa would be here, you know. I had friends ready. Trying to break in and steal something from my house. You know. Now, I'm just, but you know, we'd be ready, we'd be armed, we'd have friends there, we'd have something to protect our house. So he says, be ready, for the Son of Man comes in the hour that you do not expect. He's coming. And he goes on to talk about the servant. So it's not just a matter of your house. He goes on to add a little caveat on here. He says, if you're not, it's not only just watching your house, but when he comes, will he find you doing what he asked you to do and what he expects you to do? When the master of the house left, he left all of his goods and everything in the control of the house into his manservant, or the number one servant, and he expected him to carry on business for him, for the master. He expected him to treat everybody right. He expected him to be what the master would be. And yet this master comes back, and what does he find? He finds that the man he left in charge, well, he wasn't doing exactly like he was supposed to be doing. He was mistreating slaves, the others in the church, the others around them. He was mistreating them. And doesn't that sound a lot like the Pharisees? Because that's what they were doing. You see, Jesus here draws the parallel between the Jewish leaders who were supposed to be taking care of the nation of Israel and those in the church who are supposed to be taking care of the members of the church. Not the clergy, not the pastors, not the teachers, not those in the ministerial positions. Every member of the church. We have no Levites. That's why the least is the same as the highest, the least, the most. We're all the same, and we all have that expectation of God that we treat each other correctly, that we do the way God wanted us to do, and that we are diligent about what we do. Notice what happens to this guy. Well, the guy that does it, the guy that does the job, it says here, it'll make him ruler over all his goods. In other words, he will be the ruler. He'll be over everything. But this other guy, this servant, the evil servant, he says his master is delaying his coming. I've got lots of time, so I can just do what I want to do. So he begins to beat his fellow servants. He eats and drinks with drunkards. And all of a sudden, the master shows up. What does he do to this guy? He says it cut him in half. Oh, how gory. But that's what they did in those days, by the way. That was one of the ways of execution, was they just took a big sword or a saw and they cut him in half. He's going to cut him in half, and he's going to have him, he will be thrown into his place with the other hypocrites, where there's wailing, gnashing of teeth. So we see here in the 24th chapter of Matthew a very vivid picture of what is going to happen, laid out to answer the questions that were posed by his disciples. I know I'm late on this one, sorry. It was going to be long. Do you have any questions?
Okay, so the second question